Abrupt climate shifts, not ambition or technology, have repeatedly redrawn the human map. Some of the most dramatic migrations in history, waves of people leaving Africa, the collapse of empires, the spread of entire language families, were triggered not by conquest, but by sudden changes in rain, temperature, or sea level. How can scientists detect these ancient pulses today, and what evidence ties them to the movement of entire populations? In the journey ahead, we will trace these hidden forces from ice cores drilled in Greenland to archaeological puzzles buried beneath the Sahara, from a wet Sahara that once teemed with lakes to the dust that choked empires. By the end, you will see the fingerprints of ancient climate on the languages you speak, the borders you cross, and the genetic diversity of humanity itself. Could the next great map change already be underway? A climate pulse is not a slow drift but a sudden jolt to the system. Picture the difference between the gradual warming of a room and the moment the door bursts open. That is the kind of shock these events delivered to ancient environments. Scientists have identified several types of these abrupt shifts, each with its own signature. One well-documented example is the Dansgaard-Oeschger event, named after two researchers who spotted it in ice cores from Greenland. During these cycles, temperatures in the North Atlantic region could jump by as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a few decades. That is not a slow trend. It is a violent swing that would have turned familiar landscapes into foreign territory in a single human lifetime. Another type, called a Heinrich stadial, involved armadas of icebergs breaking off from the great ice sheets and drifting into the Atlantic, cooling the ocean and disrupting monsoon patterns far away. These pulses did not just affect Europe. When the ice sheets melted, they redirected the jet stream, pushing rainfall belts south or north, starving some regions while drowning others. In the tropics, monsoon intensity could drop or surge within a few years, turning lush grasslands into dust bowls or flooding river valleys. The key is that these changes were not gradual. They were abrupt, often lasting only a few generations or a few centuries, but they were enough to erase the ecological baselines that human groups relied on. When your ancestors had known where to find water, game, and edible plants for hundreds of years, and then suddenly that knowledge became useless, they faced a stark choice: adapt by inventing new tools and social structures, innovate by finding new ways to store food or manage risk, or relocate to a place where the old patterns still held. And as we will see, the archaeological record is full of evidence that human groups chose all three. The ability to measure these ancient pulses with precision through ice cores, sediment layers, and cave stalagmites has given researchers a remarkable timeline. It is that timeline that allows us to connect specific climate events to specific human movements, transforming what was once speculation into a clear narrative. How exactly do scientists read these ancient signals? That is the puzzle we will unlock next. The answer lies in layers of ancient ice and sediment, each one a page in the planet's diary. Scientists have assembled a remarkable toolkit to read these pages, and the beauty is that no single method tells the whole story. Instead, each technique offers a different kind of clue, and together they create a timeline precise enough to match against the movements of people. Start with ice cores drilled from the great sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. As snow falls year after year, it traps tiny bubbles of ancient air. By analyzing the ratio of oxygen isotopes in those bubbles, researchers can calculate the temperature when the snow fell. A shift in the isotope ratio means a shift in climate. But ice cores also carry dust layers. When winds were strong and landscapes dry, more dust blew onto the ice. Thick dust layers signal aridity, drought, or the expansion of deserts. In a single core, you can see the pulse of a Heinrich event or the sudden warmth of a Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle, all preserved in ice that is sometimes hundreds of thousands of years old. Then there are lake sediments. In certain lakes, seasonal changes create alternating layers of sediment called varves. One light layer from summer and one dark layer from winter form a single year, just like the rings of a tree. By counting varves, scientists can build a year-by-year record of local climate. Pollen grains trapped in those layers reveal what plants were growing nearby. A sudden drop in oak pollen and a rise in grass pollen might indicate a shift to cooler, drier conditions. Lake sediments can also preserve chemistry that tells us about rainfall and evaporation. In Africa, for example, sediment cores from Lake Victoria and Lake Malawi have revealed dramatic swings in water levels that match the timing of human migrations. The oceans hold their own archive. Deep-sea sediment cores contain the microscopic shells of foraminifera, tiny plankton that lived near the surface. The chemistry of those shells records the temperature of the water they grew in. When the shells are dated and counted, they reveal centuries of ocean temperature shifts. Another technique uses alkanons, organic molecules produced by algae. The ratio of different alkanons changes with temperature, so measuring them gives a thermometer for the ancient sea. Because ocean sediments accumulate slowly, they give a long view, but the resolution is not as fine as lake varves. Still, they are essential for seeing the big picture of global climate. Cave stalagmites are another surprising source. As water drips into a cave, it leaves behind layers of calcite. The thickness and chemistry of those layers vary with rainfall. By drilling a thin section from a stalagmite and measuring the ratios of uranium and thorium, researchers can date each layer precisely. The result is a record of tropical monsoon strength that spans thousands of years. Stalagmites from caves in China and India have shown exactly when the Asian monsoon weakened, events that coincide with the collapse of agricultural societies. Tree rings give the most detailed resolution of all, sometimes down to a single month. The width of each ring tells how favorable the growing season was. Narrow rings mean drought, cold, or stress. Wide rings mean plenty. By cross-dating trees of different ages, scientists have built continuous ring records stretching back thousands of years in some regions. These records are so precise that they can be matched to historical accounts of famine, migration, and settlement abandonment. The real power of this toolkit comes from cross-referencing. If an ice core in Greenland shows a sudden temperature plunge, and a lake sediment core in Africa shows a simultaneous drop in monsoon rainfall, and a stalagmite in India records a drought at the same time, and tree rings in Europe show a cold spell, then the evidence for a global climate pulse becomes extremely strong. And when those pulses line up with archaeological signs of population movement, like a sudden change in pottery styles or the appearance of new burial practices, the link between climate and migration moves from speculation to a well-supported story. But what happens when the pulse is so violent that it does not just move people, but erases entire ways of life? That is what we will uncover next. No other landscape on Earth has pulsed between life and death as dramatically as the Sahara. Today it is the world's largest hot desert, a sea of sand and rock that stretches across northern Africa. But buried beneath those dunes lie the remains of ancient lakes, river channels, and grasslands that once teemed with hippopotamus, elephants, and early humans. The Sahara Pump hypothesis offers a powerful explanation for these oscillations and their role in shaping human migration. The driving force is a subtle wobble in Earth's orbit called precession. Over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, the tilt of our planet shifts when the northern hemisphere experiences summer relative to the sun. When summers in the north align with a closer approach to the sun, the North African monsoon strengthens dramatically. rain belts push far inland, turning the Sahara into a green savanna dotted with shallow lakes and flowing rivers. During those humid phases, the Sahara was not a barrier, it was a corridor. Plants, animals, and hominins could move from sub-Saharan Africa northward into the Mediterranean and across the Sinai into Eurasia. But when the orbital alignment shifted again, the monsoon retreated, the rains failed, the lakes dried up. Within a few centuries, the Green Sahara collapsed back into hyper-arid desert. That is when the corridor slammed shut. Populations that had spread across the region found themselves trapped in shrinking pockets of habitability called refugia, often along the Nile Valley or the highlands of the Ethiopian plateau. The pressure of dwindling resources and growing competition drove innovation and, eventually, new waves of dispersal when the next wet phase arrived. This pulsing mechanism is now thought to have funneled early humans out of Africa in at least two major waves. The first wave, around 120,000 years ago, is still debated but supported by fossil and genetic evidence. The second, more definitive wave occurred around 60 to 70,000 years ago and gave rise to all non-African populations today. Each pulse of the pump opened a window. Each window closed with the desert. The archaeological traces of these crossings are scattered from the Nile Delta to the Levant and across the Arabian Peninsula. But the story of the first well-documented pulse is written in the sediments of a single remarkable site, a place where the evidence for a sudden climate shift and an ancient migration converge in startling clarity. One such site lies in the arid heart of southern Oman, where a cave called Hoti has preserved a record of rainfall that was written in stone. By analyzing the layers of a stalagmite that grew between 75,000 and 20,000 years ago, scientists discovered that a window of increased moisture opened between roughly 60 and 55,000 years ago. This was not a permanent change but a pulse, a few thousand years of reliable rainfall that transformed the Arabian Peninsula from a dusty barrier into a grassland dotted with freshwater springs. For the first modern humans moving out of East Africa, this window must have felt like an invitation. Genetic evidence points to that same period as the moment when a small group of ancestors, perhaps only a few hundred individuals, crossed from the Horn of Africa into what is now Yemen. Their descendants would eventually spread across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The genetic marker for this journey is a lineage known as mitochondrial Eve, not a single woman but the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through the maternal line. Her descendants carried a specific mutation that appears in every non-African population today, and the date of that mutation falls squarely within this climatic window. Archaeology supports the genetics. In the deserts of Arabia, researchers have found stone tools that match African styles, dated to around 65,000 years ago, scattered near ancient lakebeds that once held fresh water. Those lakebeds themselves tell the story. When the monsoon rains returned, the empty basins filled and the surrounding landscape turned green. Herds of gazelle and oryx moved in, followed by the people who knew how to hunt them. But the timing of this pulse may have been influenced by a far more dramatic event. Around 74,000 years ago, a super-eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia blanketed much of Asia in ash and triggered a volcanic winter that lasted years. Some researchers argue that this event created a severe population bottleneck, reducing human numbers drastically. Yet the survivors, already adapted to harsh conditions in East Africa, may have found the aftermath surprisingly favorable. The volcanic ash enriched soils, and the temporary cooling shifted global weather patterns, perhaps intensifying the monsoon that opened the Arabian corridor. Whether Toba directly enabled the migration or merely set the stage, the result was the same. A pulse of moisture turned a barrier into a bridge, and a small band of humans stepped through. They carried with them the genetic legacy that would eventually populate every continent but one. Yet this was not a single irreversible flood. The pattern of climate pulses that opened the door would also close it again, trapping populations and later releasing new waves. The migrations that followed, driven by the same rhythmic forces, would rewrite the map of Europe, reshape the genetics of Asia, and eventually reach the Americas. But before that story unfolds, we need to understand what happened to the people who stayed behind and how their own responses to climate pulses created the foundations of civilization itself. That story begins with the most recent Green Sahara, a window that opened around 11,000 years ago. At that time, Earth's orbit was tilted just a little more toward the sun during the northern summer, and the extra sunlight strengthened the African monsoon. Rain belts pushed hundreds of miles farther north than they do today. Within a few centuries, the Sahara transformed. What is now a vast expanse of sand and rock became a mosaic of shallow lakes, meandering rivers, and grasslands. The largest of these lakes, known today as Lake Mega-Chad, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, stretching across what is now Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. Its waters were home to hippopotamus and catfish. Its shores were lined with reeds and acacia trees. This was a landscape built for life, and people moved in. Across this green world, communities began to do something new. They started keeping cattle. The bones of early domesticated cattle appear at archaeological sites in the Eastern Sahara dating back 9,000 years, long before cattle were brought to Europe. These herders did not stay in one place. They followed the seasonal rains, moving their herds from one grazing ground to another. In the Tassili en Adja plateau of southern Algeria, ancient artists painted scenes of this life onto cave walls. The rock art shows cattle with long horns, people dancing, and herds being driven across open plains. The paintings are so vivid that you can almost feel the movement of the animals and the rhythm of the drummers. Those artists were recording a world that would soon vanish. One of the most remarkable settlements from this period is Nabta Playa, located in the Egyptian desert about 100 miles west of the Nile. Around 7,000 years ago, the people of Nabta Playa built a stone circle that may have served as a calendar, aligned to the summer solstice. They also buried cattle in stone-lined chambers, a ritual that suggests a deep spiritual connection to the animals they depended on. These were not just herders, they were organized communities with complex beliefs and a knowledge of astronomy that would later be refined by the civilizations along the Nile. The bounty of the Green Sahara did more than support local settlements. It also allowed people to move easily across vast distances. Pastoralists could walk from the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean without crossing a single desert. This mobility helped spread not only genes but also language. Most linguists believe that the Afroasiatic language family, which includes ancient Egyptian, Berber, Somali, and Hausa, expanded during this fertile period. The family tree seems to have originated in northeastern Africa and then spread with the movement of herders and farmers. As the climate dried again, these languages were carried into new regions, leaving their imprint on the map of Africa and the Middle East. But that drying was already on its way. Around 5,000 years ago, the orbital shift reversed. The monsoon weakened, the rains retreated. Within a few centuries, the lakes shrank and turned to salt pans. The grasslands faded to dust. The people of the Green Sahara faced a familiar choice: adapt, innovate, or relocate. Some moved into the highlands of Ethiopia and the Sahel. Others followed the remaining rivers toward the Nile Valley. As the desert closed in, the Nile corridor became a refuge, and it was there, along that thin ribbon of water, that the population density and social complexity grew into something new. The same climate pulse that had opened the Green Sahara had closed it again, funneling people into a narrow valley where they would invent writing, build pyramids, and create one of the great civilizations of history. But the pulse did not stop there. Its effects rippled far beyond Africa into the heart of the ancient world. 14,500 years ago, the ocean began to climb. Not slowly as it does today, but in a surge that felt like a wall of water rising generation by generation. This was Meltwater Pulse 1A, a period when the great ice sheets that still covered much of North America and Europe collapsed with startling speed. Within 500 years, global sea level jumped by roughly 20 meters. That is the height of a 6-story building. The cause was not a single catastrophic event but a cascade of feedbacks. As the ice sheets thinned, their surfaces lowered into warmer air, melting faster. Meltwater flowed into the ocean, lifting sea level and undercutting the remaining ice. The process fed on itself. The result was a pulse that redrew the coastlines of every continent. For the people living along the margins of that ancient world, the change was profound. Low-lying plains that had been dry land for thousands of years became flooded in the span of a few human lifetimes. The Bering Land Bridge, a broad grassy corridor that connected Siberia to Alaska, was slowly submerged, eventually cutting off the New World from the Old. In Southeast Asia, a vast region called Sundaland, which had once connected Borneo, Sumatra, and Java to the mainland, disappeared beneath the rising waters. The Persian Gulf was not yet a gulf. It was a fertile valley fed by the confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers. Communities lived there, herding animals and fishing in freshwater lakes. Then the sea broke in. The water rose, pushing those groups inland into the highlands of Arabia and the Zagros Mountains. The map of human habitation was being erased and rewritten at the same time. As coastal populations retreated, they crowded into regions that were already inhabited. This pressure may have accelerated one of the most important transitions in human history. In the Levant, the area around modern-day Israel, Jordan, and Syria, the same period saw the first experiments with settled farming. The Natufian culture, which had already begun to harvest wild grains and build permanent villages, faced a landscape that was shrinking. The flat coastal plains that had supported their way of life were drowning. With fewer resources available and more people competing for them, the incentive to control food production grew stronger. The earliest known farming communities appear in the centuries just after this pulse. It is a striking coincidence. When the ocean rose, it did not just erase land. It rearranged the relationships between people and their environment. The same sea level rise that isolated continents also brought strangers together, creating the conditions for new ideas to take root. The world beneath the waves still holds the echoes of those migrations. Archaeologists using sonar and underwater robots have mapped submerged villages off the coast of India and found stone tools on the floor of the North Sea. The maps we use today are only the latest version. Every coastline carries the memory of the pulse that reshaped it. What happened next as the ice continued to melt and the climate entered its final shift toward the warm Holocene would set the stage for the first cities and the first empires. Then, about 12,900 years ago, the warmth suddenly stopped. For a few thousand years after the Meltwater Pulse, the climate had been slowly stabilizing, moving toward the comfortable world we know today. But that trend reversed with startling speed. Within a few decades, temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped back to near glacial levels. Glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. Forests that had regrown withered into tundra. This cold snap, known as the Younger Dryas, lasted roughly 1,200 years, and it had nothing to do with the slow rhythms of Earth's orbit. Instead, scientists believe it was triggered by a massive flood of fresh water from the melting ice sheets of North America. A giant glacial lake called Lake Agassiz suddenly broke through its ice dam and poured into the Atlantic Ocean. That pulse of fresh water disrupted the ocean currents that carry warm water northward, and the conveyor belt stalled. Europe and the Northern Hemisphere were plunged back into a deep chill. For the hunter-gatherers living in the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching from the Jordan Valley to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, the Younger Dryas was a crisis. The climate had been mild and favorable for several centuries. Wild stands of wheat, barley, and lentils grew thick across the hillsides. Gazelle and wild sheep were abundant. People had settled into semi-permanent villages and were living comfortably on a diet of wild grains, nuts, and game. They had even begun to experiment with managing wild plants, perhaps by clearing competing weeds or encouraging the growth of favored varieties. But when the cold returned, the rains shifted. The reliable autumn and spring rains that had watered the hills became unpredictable. Winters grew longer and colder. Summers became drier. The wild grain harvest shrank dramatically. Gazelle herds, which had been a staple resource, declined under the pressure of the changing environment. The villages that had thrived during the warm period now faced a grinding shortage of food. The archaeological evidence for this stress is visible in the bones and seeds left behind at sites like Abu Huraira in modern-day Syria. When researchers excavated the oldest layers of that settlement, they found a clear signal of the Younger Dryas. The layer corresponding to the cold snap shows a sudden shift in the types of wild plants being gathered. Drought-tolerant weeds replaced the larger, more nutritious seeds. The bones of animals that preferred cold, dry conditions become more common, and the people turned to a desperate source of calories, the tiny seeds of wild grasses that they had previously ignored. They were grinding them into flour, but it was a poor substitute for the lost harvests. Out of this crisis came an innovation that would change everything. Somewhere in the Levant, probably in the Jordan Valley or the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, a group of people began to deliberately plant the seeds of the best-performing wild cereals. They cleared patches of ground, sowed the seeds, and returned months later to harvest. This act, simple as it sounds, required a profound mental shift. It meant planning for a future that was months away. It meant investing labor into a plot of land when the payoff was uncertain. And it meant staying in one place long enough to guard the crop from animals and other groups. The earliest known domesticated rye appears at Abu Huraira around the end of the Younger Dryas. Emmer wheat and barley soon followed. By the time the cold snap finally ended and the climate returned to its warm, stable pattern around 11,700 years ago, the experiment had taken hold. The communities that had embraced agriculture were now tied to their fields. They built permanent houses. They stored surplus grain in clay-lined pits. They began to specialize in crafts like pottery and weaving. The population grew, and when the next climate pulse, a period of sustained warmth called the Holocene climatic optimum, arrived, those farming villages expanded rapidly across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. This narrative directly challenges an older theory, long popular in anthropology, that agriculture arose from abundance. That view held that people only began farming when they had so much leisure time and such reliable wild resources that they could afford to experiment. The Younger Dryas evidence suggests the opposite. It was scarcity, not surplus, that drove the transformation. The people who invented farming were not comfortable. They were hungry. The cold pulse had squeezed their world, and they responded with an innovation that allowed them to survive in a landscape that no longer provided for free. This interpretation has profound implications for how we understand human creativity. It suggests that our greatest innovations often emerge not from ease but from pressure. The domestication of plants was not a slow, accidental discovery. It was a deliberate solution to a climate-driven crisis. And once that solution proved successful, it unleashed a cascade of changes that would eventually lead to cities, writing, and the rise of complex societies. But the story does not end with the Fertile Crescent. The same pulse that forced cereal domestication in the Levant also set the stage for a much larger movement, one that would carry those early farmers across an entire continent and transform the genetic and cultural map of Europe. What drove those farmers to leave their homeland and spread into new territories? The answer, once again, lies in the rhythm of the climate. When the Younger Dryas finally released its grip, the world entered a period of remarkable stability. For roughly 4,000 years, from around 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, the planet enjoyed a sustained warmth known as the Holocene thermal maximum. Summers were a few degrees warmer than today, and the monsoon rains pushed farther north across Africa and Asia. This was not a violent pulse like the ones that had come before, but a long, gentle season that opened windows across continents. And through those windows, farming walked. In the Fertile Crescent, the villages that had survived the cold snap now held a powerful advantage. Their domesticated wheat, barley, lentils, and flax produced reliable surpluses. With warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons, the land could support more people. Populations swelled, the villages grew into towns, and as the towns filled, pressure built to find new fields. The first farmers did not set out to conquer Europe or Asia. They simply followed the soil. When a family group outgrew its valley, a few members packed seed grain, took their cattle, and moved a day's walk into the next watershed. Over generations, that slow creep carried the agricultural package across Anatolia into the Balkans, then up the Danube Valley and across the plains of Central Europe. The archaeological signature of this movement is the linear band ceramic culture, or linear pottery culture, named for the distinctive bands carved into their clay vessels. These were the first farmers to bring domesticated crops and livestock into the heart of Europe. They arrived around 7,500 years ago, and their expansion was breathtakingly fast. Within a few centuries, linear pottery settlements dotted the landscape from Hungary to the Netherlands. They chose their village sites carefully, deep, fertile lower soils that held moisture and nutrients. They built long wooden houses oriented east-west, and they cleared the surrounding forests by burning or by stone axes. Their way of life was so successful that it replaced the local hunter-gatherer populations not through conquest, but through a kind of demographic gravity. Farmers had more children because they could feed them. Their genes spread, and their language spread with them. Today, many Europeans carry DNA that traces back to those first Neolithic migrants. But Europe was not the only region transformed by this thermal pulse. In East Asia, a different grain was on the move. Millet, a hardy cereal that thrived in dry conditions, had been domesticated in northern China around 8,000 years ago. During the Holocene thermal maximum, the monsoon rains reached farther into the interior, turning the lowest plateaus of the Yellow River basin into productive farmland. Millet farmers expanded westward along the river valleys and northward into the grasslands. Their pottery, too, carries a signature, cord-marked impressions that have been found from the Gobi Desert to the Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, a third agricultural center was emerging. Here, farmers grew wheat and barley that had likely arrived from the Fertile Crescent, along with native crops like cotton. The warm, wet climate allowed settlements to spread across the alluvial plains, setting the stage for the Harappan civilization. And on the vast steppes of Central Asia, a different kind of expansion took place. Pastoralists who herded cattle, sheep, and goats moved with the seasonal rains, covering enormous distances. They did not build permanent villages, but they carried with them a mobile way of life that would eventually connect east and west. These herders spoke languages ancestral to those of the Indo-European family, and their movements during this warm period laid the groundwork for the later horse-based migrations that would reshape Eurasia. The Holocene thermal maximum was not just a climate event, it was a demographic revolution. The window it created allowed agricultural populations to replace foragers across vast regions, redrawing the map of human density. For the first time, certain landscapes became truly crowded, and with crowding came new pressures, new conflicts, and new innovations. The same warmth that had opened the way for farmers would also, in time, expose their limits. When the climate shifted again, as it always does, the societies that had grown so dependent on their fields would face a test far more severe than any they had known. Then, around 5,000 years ago, the rains began to fail. It did not happen overnight, but in the span of a few centuries, a landscape that had supported herds of cattle, thriving villages, and a network of interconnected lakes turned into an expanse of drifting sand and rock. The Green Sahara collapsed. For the people who had lived there for generations, the choice was stark. They could follow the retreating water, or they could adapt to a world that no longer offered the same abundance. Thousands of families chose to move. Some headed south into the highlands of Ethiopia and the grasslands of the Sahel, where the monsoon still delivered enough rain to sustain life. Others followed a different path. They followed the rivers, and one river in particular drew them in like a magnet, the Nile. As the desert expanded, the Nile Valley became a narrow ribbon of green cutting through an increasingly hostile landscape. The river itself was eternal. It flowed every year, carrying water from the highlands of East Africa down to the Mediterranean, but it had not always been the center of human activity. During the wet phase, the Sahara had offered so much room to roam that the valley was just one option among many. Now it became a refuge. People poured into the floodplain from the dried-up basins to the west and from the encroaching desert to the east. They arrived with their cattle, their seeds, their pottery styles, and their gods. The Nile corridor grew crowded, and that crowding, that concentration of people and ideas and labor, created something new. In previous ages, when the climate pulsed, people had simply dispersed. They scattered across the landscape, following the resources. But now, with the desert closing in, they could not scatter. They had to stay. They had to learn to live together in a thin strip of land that was less than 10 miles wide in many places. The pressure of numbers forced innovation. To feed a growing population, farmers had to intensify their use of the land. They dug irrigation channels. They developed systems to control the annual flood. They began to coordinate their labor across entire communities. This was not the work of isolated villages anymore. It required organization, leadership, and a shared calendar. And it worked. The Nile floodplain, rich with silt deposited each year, could produce astonishing yields. Surplus grain fed specialists who did not farm. Potters, weavers, priests, warriors, and scribes. By around 5,000 years ago, the first hieroglyphs appear in the archaeological record. Within a few centuries, the multiple small kingdoms of the Nile Valley had consolidated into two distinct realms, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. And then, around 3,100 years before the Common Era, those two realms were unified under a single ruler, a king named Nama, or Menes. The dynastic period had begun. This is not a coincidence. The birth of pharaonic civilization is directly linked to the climate pulse that dried the Sahara. The concentration of people into the Nile Valley provided the demographic density, the economic surplus, and the social complexity needed to build a state. Without that pulse, the scattered herders and farmers of the Green Sahara would have remained just that, scattered. The desert forced them together, and from that compression emerged one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. But the story does not end at the Nile. To the south, the same drying pulse sent other populations on a different journey. As the Sahara turned to desert, pastoralists who had once ranged across the central and eastern Sahara were pushed into the grasslands of sub-Saharan Africa. They moved with their cattle along the shrinking margins of the desert, following the seasonal rains. Over generations, they pushed deeper into West Africa, East Africa, and the Great Lakes region. These migrants carried more than cattle. They carried language. The herders who moved south and west spoke languages ancestral to the Niger-Congo family, which today includes Swahili, Yoruba, Igbo, and hundreds of other languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people. Those who moved east and into the Sahel carried Nilo-Saharan languages. the root of modern Mossai, Dinka, and Nuer. The map of African languages today reflects the shape of that ancient migration. In both cases, the same pulse that gave birth to the pyramids also scattered seeds across an entire continent. The drying of the Sahara did not just move people. It rearranged the human landscape of Africa. It concentrated some populations into a narrow valley where they built a civilization that would inspire awe for millennia. And it dispersed others across a vast region where they adapted, diversified, and created new cultures. The climate pulse was a single event with two opposite effects: compression and expansion. Both shaped the world we live in, but a question lingers. If the same forces that created the Green Sahara and then destroyed it could birth a civilization, what happens when the pulse reverses again? What happens when the pressure to concentrate returns in a world that is already crowded? A different pulse was beating across the vast grasslands of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Around 5,000 years ago, while the Sahara was drying and the Nile Valley was filling with refugees, a more subtle but equally transformative shift was unfolding on the plains north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The climate there was changing too, becoming more arid and more seasonal. Winters grew harsher, summers grew drier. The forests that had once dotted the river valleys began to retreat, replaced by open grasslands that stretched to every horizon. For the people living on that steppe, this shift was not a disaster. It was an opportunity. The key was mobility. When the landscape becomes more arid and the grass becomes patchy, you cannot stay in one place with a herd of cattle. You have to move, you have to follow the rain. The Yamnaya culture, which emerged on the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 5,300 years ago, had perfected that strategy. They were not the first pastoralists in the region, but they were the first to combine a few crucial innovations: the domestication of the horse, the invention of wheeled wagons, and a highly specialized diet of meat and dairy. Their wagons were not just for transporting goods. They were mobile homes sturdy enough to carry families across hundreds of miles of open country. With horses to pull them and cattle and sheep to herd, the Yamnaya could exploit a vast territory without ever building a permanent settlement. And when the climate pulse intensified the seasonality of the steppe, making the summers too dry to support farming but the grasslands rich enough for grazing, the Yamnaya did something that would change the genetic and linguistic map of Europe and Asia. They expanded. Genomic evidence clearly reveals this expansion. By analyzing ancient DNA from human remains across Europe, researchers have traced a massive migration of Yamnaya, or closely related people, into Central and Northern Europe around 4,800 years ago. The genetic signature of these steppe herders appears suddenly in the burial sites of the corded ware culture, which spanned from Germany to the Ural Mountains. The corded ware people adopted Yamnaya pottery styles, burial practices, and most importantly, their genes. In many regions of Europe today, the majority of the population carries ancestry that traces back to that steppe migration. The arrival of the Yamnaya did not simply add a new layer to the existing population. It largely replaced the earlier Neolithic farmers who had spread into Europe thousands of years before. How did a group of mobile herders overwhelm the established farming communities? The answer may lie in their resilience. The Yamnaya diet, rich in meat and dairy from their herds, made them taller and stronger on average than the grain-dependent farmers. They also had horses and wagons, which gave them a tactical advantage in movement and conflict. But the real driver was demographic. In a landscape where farming was becoming less reliable due to the drying climate, the pastoralist lifestyle offered a more stable food supply. The Yamnaya had more children, and those children survived to have more children of their own. Over just a few centuries, their genes swept across the continent. This expansion also carried the ancestors of the Indo-European language family. the connection between the Yamnaya horizon and the spread of Indo-European languages is one of the strongest correlations in historical linguistics. The original Indo-European homeland has been debated for centuries, but the steppe hypothesis now dominates. When the Yamnaya moved into Europe, they brought a language that would eventually evolve into the Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Baltic, Slavic, and Greek branches. When they moved east into the steppes of Central Asia, they planted the seeds that would grow into the Indo-Iranian languages, Persian, Hindi, Urdu, and the many tongues of the ancient Silk Road. The same climate pulse that pushed the Sahara to its breaking point and drove the formation of the Egyptian state was simultaneously pushing a different group of herders to pour into Europe and reshape its linguistic map. The mechanism was not identical, but the logic was the same. A change in rainfall and temperature made one way of life obsolete and another way of life viable. The people who adapted to the new reality did not just survive, they multiplied, they spread. They left descendants who speak languages we use today in cities from Dublin to Delhi. There is still debate among researchers about the exact nature of the climate shift on the steppe. Was it a general drying trend or a cooling event that shortened the growing season? Some experts point to a period of cooler, wetter conditions that paradoxically made the grasslands more productive for grazing. Others argue for increased aridity that drove pastoralists to move farther in search of water. The details are still being refined, but the broad picture is clear. A climatic trigger, whether drying or cooling, set the stage for one of the most significant demographic events in human history. The horses that the Yamnaya rode and the wheels that turned under their wagons did not just carry them across the steppe. They carried the foundations of a language family that now contains over 3 billion speakers. When you speak English or any of its relatives, you are echoing a pulse that began 5,000 years ago on a windswept grassland, and that same pulse was not finished yet. It would continue to reverberate, driving another wave of expansion that would bring Indo-European languages to the edge of the Atlantic and the foothills of the Himalayas. But before that journey reached its end, a different current of climate-driven movement was already pulling people across the great mountain ranges of Central Asia, connecting east and west in ways that would forever alter the human story. Around 2200 before the Common Era, the rain stopped. Not a single bad season, not a temporary dry spell, but a grinding, multi-century drought that squeezed the life out of entire civilizations. This was the 4.2 Kiloyear event, named for the approximate number of years before the present. It is one of the best documented climate pulses in prehistory, and its effects were felt from the western Mediterranean to the shores of the Yellow Sea. In Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Akkadian Empire, the fields that had once produced abundant barley and wheat turned to dust. The empire had been the first to unite the region under a single rule, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. But when the rain failed, the whole system buckled. Soil salinity rose as farmers tried to irrigate with shrinking water supplies. Crop yields plummeted. Famine spread through the cities. The central government could no longer collect taxes or maintain order. Within a few decades, the Akkadian Empire dissolved into competing city-states and wandering groups of displaced people. Archaeological layers tell the story. At the site of Tel Leilan in modern Syria, researchers found a thick layer of wind-blown dust and abandonment debris sitting directly on top of the imperial administrative buildings. The site was simply left empty, its inhabitants scattering across the landscape. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid builders like Khufu, faced a similar crisis. The annual flood of the Nile, which had always been the backbone of Egyptian agriculture, began to shrink. The river's flow depends on monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, and when those rains weakened, the Nile's waters dropped. The floodplain could no longer support the dense population. Tombs from the First Intermediate Period, the era of collapse that followed, show evidence of malnutrition in the skeletons. Inscriptions from that time speak of starving people and the breakdown of order. The great mortuary temples were looted, and local rulers broke away from central control. The unified kingdom fragmented into multiple competing regions, each struggling to feed its own people. Far to the east, the Indus Valley civilization, a contemporary of Egypt and Mesopotamia, was also unraveling. Its cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of urban planning with grid-patterned streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized brick sizes. But the same drought that parched the Near East shifted the monsoon patterns over South Asia. The seasonal rains that had watered the Indus floodplain began to weaken. Rivers that had once flowed year-round became seasonal. The great urban centers were gradually abandoned, not all at once, but in a slow, grinding process over generations. People moved to smaller villages in the foothills or to the east, where the Ganges plain still received enough rainfall. The writing system of the Indus, still undeciphered today, disappeared along with the cities. In the Aegean, the early Bronze Age societies of mainland Greece, such as the fortified settlement of Lerna, entered a period of decline. The same drought that affected Anatolia and the Levant likely reduced agricultural yields, leading to population loss and the abandonment of many sites. The distinctive pottery styles and building traditions of that era vanished from the record, replaced by simpler, more local forms. The chaos did not only empty cities. It also pushed people into motion. In Mesopotamia, the drought-weakened states could no longer defend their borders. Semi-nomadic groups from the Syrian steppe, known as the Amorites, began to migrate into the fertile river valleys. These were not invaders in the traditional sense. They were herders and farmers looking for water and pasture, but their arrivals shifted the region's demographics and culture. Over the next few centuries, Amorite dynasties would come to rule many of the city-states that rose from the ruins, including Babylon itself under the famous King Hammurabi. In Egypt, a similar movement unfolded. The Delta region, already reeling from the low Nile floods, saw the influx of people from the east, from Canaan and the Sinai. These newcomers, later known as the Hyksos, brought advanced bronze working technology, new weapons, and the horse-drawn chariot. They gradually established themselves in the northeastern delta, eventually ruling over a large part of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The political and ethnic map of the Near East was rewritten in the aftermath of the drought. The old order of unified empires gave way to a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and migrant populations. Languages, customs, and technologies spread along the routes of displaced people. The Amorites carried their Semitic dialects into the heart of Mesopotamia, setting the stage for the Akkadian language's eventual replacement by Aramaic. The Hyksos brought innovations that would later be adopted by the New Kingdom Egyptians, but the 4.2 Kiloyear event did not just rearrange power, it also forced a deeper adaptation. Communities that survived had to develop new ways of storing food, managing water, and organizing labor. The old reliance on a single annual flood or a central grain storehouse was no longer enough. In the centuries that followed, new forms of political organization emerged, more flexible and resilient, better suited to a world that could no longer be counted on to be stable. The drought had passed, but the world it left behind was fundamentally different from the one it had broken. A second great drought around 1200 BC shattered a world that had taken centuries to build. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a network of powerful kingdoms and wealthy city-states had grown rich on trade in copper, tin, grain, and wine. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia controlled vast territories and commanded armies equipped with chariots. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece, places like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, were centers of administration that kept detailed records on clay tablets. The city of Ugarit, on the coast of modern Syria, was a bustling port where merchants from Cyprus, Egypt, and Mesopotamia exchanged goods and ideas. This interconnected system, known as the Late Bronze Age world, seemed stable, but it was built on a delicate foundation. When the rains failed, that foundation cracked and then crumbled. Paleoclimate records from two key sites reveal the severity of the drought. In eastern Turkey, the sediments of Lake Van preserve a clear signal. Layers of calcium carbonate deposited during dry periods increase sharply around the time of the collapse. Isotopic analysis of those layers shows a prolonged shift to arid conditions, indicating that the region received far less rainfall for several decades, possibly more than a century. A similar story comes from the Sorek cave in Israel, where stalagmites have recorded the intensity of Mediterranean rainfall. The growth layers in the speleothems narrowed dramatically during this period. The signal is unmistakable: a severe, multi-decadal drought that struck the heartland of the Hittite Empire, the Aegean, and the Levant almost simultaneously. The effects were catastrophic for societies that depended on rain-fed agriculture. The Hittite heartland, already prone to food shortages, could not endure years of failed harvests. The capital city of Hattusa was abandoned. The imperial administration collapsed, leaving Anatolia fragmented into small, isolated communities. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace centers lost the ability to control their territories. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record desperate attempts to allocate grain and livestock, but the system broke down. The palaces were burned and abandoned. The population dropped sharply. Writing, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade vanished from the Greek mainland for centuries. In Ugarit, the last king sent desperate letters to neighboring rulers pleading for grain. No help arrived, the city was destroyed, and its archives were buried in the rubble. Into this vacuum moved groups of people whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, carved on the walls of a temple built by Pharaoh Ramesses III, describe a coalition of invaders who swept across the eastern Mediterranean. The texts name several groups: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and others. Egyptian scribes recorded that no country could stand against their arms, from Hatti to Kode, Karkemish, Arzawa, and Alashia. These were not a single unified army but a collection of displaced peoples, some possibly refugees from the collapsed kingdoms, others raiders seeking new lands. The precise origins of each group remain debated, but the inscriptions make clear that their arrival reshaped the entire region. The cascading effects of these movements reorganized the political map. On the island of Cyprus, known in antiquity as Alashia, the collapse of the Mycenaean and Hittite trade networks led to a transformation of settlements. New fortified sites appeared, and the island became a hub for the production of copper and pottery that mixed Aegean and local styles. Along the southern coast of Canaan, the Peleset, who are usually identified with the biblical Philistines, established a pentapolis of city-states: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. Their material culture shows clear Aegean influences in pottery, architecture, and burial practices, suggesting that they brought with them the traditions of the collapsed Mycenaean world. The Philistine cities thrived, becoming powerful centers that would later clash with the Israelite kingdoms emerging in the highlands. Other groups moved more peacefully into the void. In the Levant, the old city-states of the Bronze Age gave way to smaller kingdoms and tribal polities. The Aramean kingdoms, such as Damascus and Hamath, grew in influence. The Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, which had weathered the crisis better than most, re-emerged as maritime powers. Their sailors and merchants would soon spread across the Mediterranean, founding colonies that reached as far as Spain and North Africa. The Iron Age had begun, and with it a new world order that no longer depended on the grand palatial economies of the past. The drought that broke the Bronze Age world did not just destroy. It cleared the ground for a more decentralized, more resilient pattern of human organization. The old empires had been too rigid, too dependent on a single source of grain and a single system of control. The societies that rose from the ashes were smaller, more adaptable, and better equipped to handle the unpredictable rhythms of a climate that could never be counted on to stay the same. The map that emerged from this crisis would shape the biblical world, the classical era, and the foundations of Western civilization. Around 2,800 years ago, the sky turned dry over Asia. A new climate pulse gripped the continent, one that would reshape the political and cultural map for centuries. This event, known by scientists as the 2.8 Kiloyear aridification, brought a prolonged period of drought that affected a vast arc from the Mediterranean through Central Asia and into the heart of China. Its signature is etched into ice cores from the Kiloyear ice cap on the Tibetan Plateau, where layers of dust and altered oxygen isotopes mark a clear shift toward drier conditions. Lake sediments tell the same story. In the Altai Mountains, cores from Lake Kotokul show a sharp drop in water levels. In the Caspian Sea, the shoreline receded. In Central Asia, the grasslands that had supported a mix of settled farmers and mobile herders began to thin out, becoming more like the steppe we know today. The people who lived there faced a familiar dilemma. The land could no longer support everyone in the old way. For the nomadic groups of the steppe, the drought was not simply a hardship. It was a catalyst. They had always moved with their herds following seasonal grazing. But when the rains failed year after year, the distances they had to travel grew longer, and the competition for the remaining pastures sharpened. This pressure forced them to become more efficient, more organized, and more aggressive in defending their resources. Out of this crucible emerged the Scythian culture, a confederation of mounted warriors who dominated the Eurasian steppe for centuries. Their way of life was built around the horse. They were among the first to master mounted archery, riding and shooting with devastating accuracy. They covered enormous distances, moving their felt tents and herds across the open plains. The drought did not create the horse-based pastoralist lifestyle, but it accelerated it. Those who could not adapt were pushed aside or absorbed. The Scythians and related groups began to expand outward, pressing against the sedentary civilizations on their borders. To the south, they raided the settled kingdoms of the Near East. To the east, they pushed into the Tarim Basin and the edges of the Chinese sphere. Their mobility and military power restructured the ancient trade routes of Central Asia. The old networks that had connected the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean were now supplemented by new arteries that ran across the steppe, carrying gold, furs, and stories of distant lands. These routes would later be woven into the fabric of the Silk Road, but the pulse did not stop at the steppe. In East Asia, the same drought gripped the heartland of the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou had ruled over the Yellow River Plain for centuries, their power based on a system of feudal alliances and the mandate of heaven. But the prolonged dry spell weakened the agricultural base of the state. The lowest soils that had fed the Zhou heartland turned dusty. Records from the period describe failing harvests and the movement of people seeking water. The central authority began to fragment. The kings lost control over their regional lords, and a period of chaos known as the Spring and Autumn Period descended on China. In response, some of the Zhou states looked south. They pushed their borders into the Yangtze River Basin, where the monsoon rains still brought enough water for crops. This southern expansion brought the Chinese cultural and political sphere into contact with the non-Chinese peoples of the south, the ancestors of many modern minority groups. It also accelerated the development of hydraulic engineering, the construction of canals and irrigation systems designed to manage water in an increasingly unpredictable environment. The same pressures that drove the Scythians to become mounted warriors on the steppe drove the Chinese states to become centralized, bureaucratic empires. They learned to organize labor on a massive scale, to store grain in state granaries, and to standardize weights and measures. The foundations of the later kin state were laid in this period of crisis. When the drought finally eased, the world it left behind was different. The Scythians had established themselves as the dominant power of the steppe, their influence stretching from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. In China, the Zhou dynasty never fully recovered. Its successor states, hardened by centuries of competition, would eventually be unified by the Qin, who imposed a single script, a single currency, and a single set of laws. The 2.8 Kiloyear event is often overlooked in popular history, but its fingerprints are everywhere. It pushed the steppe nomads toward the mounted warfare that would define them for a millennium. It pressed the Chinese states to consolidate and expand, laying the groundwork for the first imperial unification, and it restructured the routes and borders that would later support the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the Qin Empire, two of the most influential polities of the ancient world. A dry spell that lasted only a few generations had redrawn the map of Asia from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Centuries later, a different kind of warmth blessed the Mediterranean world. Between roughly 200 years before the Common Era and 400 years after, the climate of Europe and the Near East entered a period of unusual stability. Summers were warm and reliably sunny. Winters brought enough rain to fill the rivers but not so much as to flood the fields. Grain harvests were abundant year after year. Olive trees thrived on hillsides that today would be too dry. Vineyards spread across Gaul and Iberia. The Roman Empire, already a formidable military and political power, was handed an extraordinary gift by nature. When the land produces a surplus, population grows. When population grows, so do cities. When cities grow, trade networks expand and state power deepens. The Roman economy, which depended heavily on wheat from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, was sustained by the predictable rhythm of the seasons. The legions were fed. The grain dole in Rome kept the urban populace content. The empire reached its maximum territorial extent during this warm period, and it is no coincidence. But the climate that gave so generously could also take everything away. Around 536 of the Common Era, the sky turned dark. Contemporary writers described a sun that shone only 4 hours a day, casting a dim, bluish light. The warmth vanished. A series of massive volcanic eruptions, most likely in Iceland and North America, had thrown so much ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere that sunlight was blocked for years. The result was a global cooling event that lasted more than a century. Historians call it the Late Antique Little Ice Age. The effects were catastrophic across the northern hemisphere. In the Mediterranean, the summers that had once ripened wheat now brought frost. Snow fell in July, the Nile flood failed, and with it the grain supply for Constantinople. Crop failures struck year after year. The stored grain rotted or was eaten by rats. Famine spread through the cities of the Byzantine Empire, and then came the plague. In 541, a disease known as the Justinianic Plague arrived in the port of Pelusium in Egypt. It spread rapidly along the trade routes, reaching Constantinople within months. The illness killed a significant portion of the population, perhaps 30 to 50% in some regions, but the conditions had been prepared by the cold and the hunger. People whose bodies were already weakened by malnutrition could not fight off infection. The combination of volcanic winter, failed harvests, and repeated waves of plague depopulated vast areas of the Roman world. The empire that had once seemed eternal was now hollowed out. The demographic collapse did not just weaken the Byzantine state, it created a vacuum that drew in new peoples from the north and east. On the steppes and forests of Central and Eastern Europe, the same cold pulse had changed the landscape. Pastures shrank. The population of pastoralist groups, already under pressure, looked south and west for land that could still support them. The Avars, a confederation of steppe warriors, pushed into the Carpathian Basin. The Slavs, who had previously lived in scattered villages north of the Danube, began a slow but persistent migration into the abandoned farmland of the Balkans. The Bulgars, a Turkic herding people, moved across the Black Sea steppes and established a powerful state in the territory of modern Bulgaria. These were not single invasions but decades of movement. The Byzantine frontiers, which had held for centuries, could not withstand the pressure. Garrison towns were abandoned. Rural populations fled to fortified hilltop settlements. The cultural and linguistic map of the Balkans was fundamentally rewritten. Slavic languages spread into regions where Latin and Greek had dominated. The Avars introduced new forms of cavalry warfare. The Bulgars brought a political structure that would eventually merge with Slavic culture to form the medieval Bulgarian state. The same volcanic winter that shattered the Mediterranean order also destabilized the other great powers of the age. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire faced a series of harsh winters and droughts that weakened its agricultural base. The royal treasury was drained by decades of war with Byzantium, wars that had been fought with increased intensity as both empires scrambled for resources. The Sasanian state could not recover, and when the armies of Islam arrived in the middle of the 7th century, they found an empire already exhausted by climate and conflict. In China, the cold pulse disrupted the monsoon. The Northern Wei dynasty, which had ruled over the Yellow River Plain, was already in decline. The crop failures and famines of the mid-600s triggered peasant revolts and the collapse of centralized authority. The Sui and early Tang dynasties were forced to invest heavily in grain storage and canal systems to buffer against future shocks. The Cold Period also weakened the steppe nomads who had long threatened China's northern borders. The Gokta Khaganate, a powerful confederation, fragmented as their herds dwindled. For a few decades, China's frontiers became more secure. The late antique Little Ice Age was not a single event but a cascade of consequences. The volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun set off a chain reaction that ended the old world of the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire, that emptied the Balkans and repopulated them with new peoples, and that forced the Byzantine state to reinvent itself as a smaller, more defensive power. The climate pulse did not simply cause hardship. It restructured the geopolitical order of early medieval Eurasia. The empires that survived were those that could adapt. Those that could not were replaced by peoples who had learned to move with the land. The map of the 7th century looked very different from the map of the 4th. And the forces behind that transformation were not chariots or siege engines. They were ash, cold, and hunger. Then the cold receded and a new warmth settled over the North Atlantic. From roughly 950 to 1250 of the Common Era, a period known as the medieval climate anomaly brought milder temperatures to the northern latitudes. For the Norse seafarers of Scandinavia, this was not just a pleasant change in weather, it was an opening. The sea ice that had blocked the northern routes retreated. The stormy waters of the North Atlantic became more predictable, and the green pastures of Iceland, which the Norse had already settled, grew even more inviting. They sailed west and they kept sailing. Around 982, a Norseman named Eric the Red explored a large island that lay beyond Iceland. He called it Greenland, a name meant to attract settlers. And for a time, the name was accurate. The milder climate allowed the coastal fjords to support grazing livestock. The settlers built stone churches, farmed hay, and raised cattle and sheep. At its peak, the Greenland colony numbered several thousand people spread across two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. They traded walrus ivory and furs for grain and iron from Europe. They lived at the edge of the known world, but they were not isolated. From Greenland, they pushed farther. Around the year 1000, a crew led by Leif Erikson reached the coast of a land they called Vinland. the sagas describe vines, wild grapes, and abundant timber. Archaeological evidence at El Ants Ox Meadows in Newfoundland confirms that the Norse built turf houses there, at least for a season or two. They had stepped onto the North American continent 5 centuries before Columbus. The same warm pulse that opened the doors of the North Atlantic also transformed life in Europe. In England, the average summer temperature was 1 or 2 degrees Celsius warmer than today. That may not sound like much, but it extended the growing season and improved yields. Villages expanded, forests were cleared, and the population of England roughly doubled between the 11th and 13th centuries. The Domesday Book of 1086 records over 1.5 million people. By 1300, that number had climbed past 4 million. The countryside was full of new fields, new churches, and new markets. Yet the warmth that blessed the north did not fall evenly across the globe. In the American Southwest, the same climate shift brought persistent drought. The ancestral Puebloans, who had built thriving communities in the canyons of the Colorado Plateau, faced a crisis. Their irrigation systems depended on reliable snowfall and summer rains. But the rains weakened. Tree ring records from the region show a series of severe, multi-year droughts during the 12th and 13th centuries, including a mega-drought that lasted more than 3 decades. The great stone dwellings at Choco Canyon were gradually abandoned. The people moved south and east, regrouping along the Rio Grande and into the highlands of Arizona. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo tribes. In the Andes, the medieval climate anomaly also brought prolonged dry spells. Lake sediment cores from the Peruvian highlands show a drop in water levels that coincides with the decline of the Wari and Tiwanaku civilizations. These societies had relied on elaborate canal systems and raised fields to support large populations. When the water sources shrank, the agricultural foundation cracked. The cities were emptied. The people dispersed into smaller, more mobile communities that would later form the base of the Inca Empire. The Norse Greenland colony, however, would not find a way to adapt when the window finally closed. Around 1250, the climate began to shift again. The warmth faded, the sea ice thickened, the growing seasons shortened, the hay harvest shrank. The cattle starved. The Greenlanders tried to adapt. They turned to sealing, eating more fish and seafood. They abandoned the poorer farms and consolidated into the larger settlements. But they could not bring themselves to abandon their European way of life entirely. They continued to build churches, to bury their dead in Christian cemeteries, and to send ivory back to Europe in exchange for grain and iron. The supply ships from Norway grew rarer. The last recorded contact with the eastern settlement was around 1410. When a Norwegian merchant ship reached Greenland in the early 1500s, they found only abandoned farms and the bones of livestock in the fields. The Norse colony had vanished. The same climate pulse that had given them a foothold in the New World had taken it away, and this is the deeper lesson of the medieval climate anomaly. A warm pulse can open a window, but it does not guarantee a permanent home. The societies that thrive during such windows are those that remain flexible, that can change their way of life when the window begins to close. The Puebloans moved, adapted, and persisted. The Norse Greenlanders did not. Their story is a reminder that the map is never fixed. It shifts with the weather, and the lines we draw on it today may be erased by a shift that is already on the horizon. The sun dimmed across the northern hemisphere for more than 5 centuries. What historians call the Little Ice Age did not arrive as a single punishing winter, but as a long, grinding shift that began around 1300 and did not fully release its grip until the middle of the 19th century. Glaciers advanced in the Alps, swallowing entire villages. The Thames River in London froze so regularly that frost fairs were held on the ice. In Scandinavia, the sea ice expanded, cutting off the Norse settlements in Greenland and eventually starving them out. The cold was not uniform. Some decades were brutal, others milder, but the overall trend was a world that had lost the dependable warmth of the medieval period. And that change sent shockwaves through every society that depended on the land. In Europe, the first major blow came between 1315 and 1317. Heavy rains fell across the continent for 2 straight years. The grain rotted in the fields. Hay could not be dried for winter feed, so livestock perished. What followed was the Great Famine, a catastrophe that historians estimate may have taken the lives of 10 to 25% of the population in some regions. The suffering was immense, but the response reshaped the landscape. Villages were abandoned, fields reverted to forest. Survivors moved to towns or sought work in regions that had been less affected. This demographic shock, combined with the onset of the plague in the 1440s, permanently altered the social structure of Europe. The old feudal system weakened. Land became more available, and laborers could demand better conditions. The crisis of the Little Ice Age did not just cause hardship. It created the conditions for social mobility and, eventually, for the expansionist energy that would drive European explorers across the oceans. To the east, the cold also unseated the greatest empire of the age. The Mongol Empire had been built on the productivity of the steppe. The grasses that fed the horses and herds of the Mongol armies depended on a delicate balance of rain and warmth. When the Little Ice Age set in, the pasture-lands shrank. Droughts became more frequent. The Mongol herders could no longer support the same number of animals, and the unity of the empire fractured. The Yuan dynasty in China, which had been established by Kublai Khan, weakened and then collapsed in 1368, replaced by the native Ming dynasty. The Mongol retreat was not a single event but a slow contraction driven by a climate that no longer favored their way of life. The horsemen who had once ridden from Korea to Hungary were reduced to fighting over scraps of grassland. In North America, similar pressures reshaped the indigenous map. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, already stressed by earlier droughts, abandoned many of their cliff dwellings and moved to more reliable water sources. The Mississippian culture, which had built great mound cities like Cahokia, also declined as the cooling climate made agriculture less predictable. The population of Cahokia, which had once numbered tens of thousands, dispersed into smaller settlements. These movements were not invasions but adaptations. The Little Ice Age also disrupted the great oceanic systems. The trade winds that had carried Ming dynasty treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean shifted. The monsoons that filled the rivers of China became less reliable. The Ming court, facing internal pressures and a changing climate, abruptly ended the voyages of Admiral Zheng He after 1433. The massive treasure ships were left to rot in port. China turned inward, focusing on defending its borders against the resurgent Mongol threat from the north, a threat that was itself driven by the same cold that was shrinking pastures on the steppe. In the Ottoman Empire, the chill brought a different kind of crisis. The empire depended on grain from the Balkans and Anatolia, but the shorter growing seasons and unpredictable weather led to repeated harvest failures. The central government struggled to feed its growing cities and its armies. The Ottomans responded by tightening control over trade routes and by expanding into new territories, but the climate pressure made administration more difficult. The period of stagnation that followed was not purely political, it was environmental, but the most profound consequence of the Little Ice Age was the push it gave to European exploration and colonization. As the cold pinched resources at home, nations looked outward. The fisheries of Newfoundland, discovered by Basque and English fishermen, became a vital source of protein. The search for new trade routes to Asia, driven in part by the desire to bypass Ottoman-controlled land routes, intensified. The same cold that had frozen the Thames also inspired innovations in shipbuilding and navigation. The caravel, the galleon, the compass, and the astrolabe were not invented because of the cold, but the economic pressure to find new lands gave their development urgency. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he was not just seeking a route to the Indies. He was responding to a world that had grown smaller, colder, and hungrier. The colonies that followed in the Americas, Africa, and Asia were not simply the products of European ambition. They were the result of a climate pulse that had pushed entire populations into motion, forcing them to seek new sources of food, wealth, and land. The Little Ice Age redrew the map of the world not by freezing it, but by setting in motion the forces that would create the modern global order. The centuries of cold that began around 1300 did not end until the mid-1800s, and by then, the human landscape had been permanently transformed. But not all climate pulses lasted decades or centuries. Some struck like a door slammed shut, arriving in a single season and darkening the sky for years. The most violent of these short, sharp shocks came not from the ocean or the sun, but from deep beneath the Earth's surface. A volcanic eruption that hurls ash and sulfur high into the stratosphere can wrap the planet in a veil of particles, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the globe. When the eruption is powerful enough, that cooling becomes a volcanic winter, a sudden, artificial winter that can last 2, 3, or even 5 years. The effects are devastating. Crops fail across continents, livestock starve, rivers freeze in summer, and when the food runs out, people have no choice but to move. The year 536 of the Common Era stands as one of the most dramatic examples. That year, the sun dimmed. Contemporary writers described a sun that gave no heat, a moon that appeared blue, and shadows that vanished at noon. The cause was a massive volcanic eruption, probably in Iceland, though some researchers point to a second eruption in El Salvador around the same time. The combined sulfate load was enough to blot out the light for over a year. The summer of 536 brought frost in July. Snow fell on the harvest. Grain rotted in the fields. The following 2 years were no better. The resulting famine was so severe that the Roman historian Procopius recorded that many people had nothing to eat and died of starvation. The weakened population then faced the Justinianic plague, a disease that arrived in 541 and swept through a malnourished, vulnerable society. The demographic collapse that followed did not just empty cities, it opened the door for new peoples to move in. The Avars, the Slavs, and the Bulgars found abandoned farmland and undefended borders. Their migrations, which began as trickles, became floods. The volcanic winter of 536 did not cause those migrations, but it accelerated them, removing the human obstacles that had once blocked the way. Centuries later, in 1257, the Samalas volcano on the Indonesian island of Lombok erupted with a force that dwarfed anything in recorded history. It was one of the largest eruptions of the past 10,000 years, ejecting so much sulfur that the global temperature dropped by roughly 1 degree Celsius for several years. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere show a sharp narrowing in those years, a sign of cold summers. In England, the grain harvest failed. In Japan, the frost killed rice paddies. In the Andes, the ice core records spike with sulfuric acid. The Samalas eruption did not topple empires on its own, but it pushed already stressed societies toward collapse. The Mongol Empire, which had been expanding for decades, faced a series of harsh winters that killed horses and reduced the mobility of their armies. The successors of Genghis Khan struggled to maintain control over their vast territories. The eruption may have weakened the Mongols just enough to allow the emerging powers of Europe and the Middle East to resist their advance. The map of the 13th century might have looked very different if that volcano had stayed quiet. The most famous volcanic winter in modern memory came in 1815, when Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa erupted, again in Indonesia. The explosion was heard 2,000 kilometers away. The ash cloud rose so high that it drifted around the world, creating vivid sunsets for years. But the immediate consequence was the year without a summer in 1816. Snow fell in New England in June, lakes froze in July, the corn crop in the United States was decimated. In Europe, the harvest failed across the continent. Food prices soared, riots broke out in Switzerland, France, and England. The famine drove thousands to emigrate, many heading to the Americas. The migration patterns of the early 19th century, already shaped by economic pressure, were given a sharp, sudden push by the cold and hunger of 1816. The Tambora eruption did not create a new path, but it widened one that already existed. Each of these volcanic winters shows the same pattern. A single event, lasting only a few years, can tip the balance. It can weaken a state that was already under pressure, empty a region that was already fragile, and send people moving along routes they might otherwise have stayed on. The pulses are short, but their consequences echo for generations. The map of the world is not only shaped by the slow rhythms of the ice ages, it is also shaped by the ash and sulfur of a single mountain, bursting open and stealing the light. The human map we see today is a layered archive of these ancient shocks. Every genetic marker, every language family, every cultural boundary carries the signature of a climate pulse that once pushed people into motion and then left them to settle in new places. When scientists overlay maps of human DNA with maps of past rainfall and temperature, the correlations are too strong to ignore. The distribution of haplogroup R1 in Europe, for example, traces almost perfectly the path of the Yamnaya expansion that began 5,000 years ago. The highest frequencies of this genetic lineage are found in Eastern Europe, the Pontic steppe, and then spread westward across the plains into Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Researchers can even date the arrival of these genes to specific regions using ancient DNA from burials. In every case, the timing matches the aridification pulse that pushed the steppe herders outward. The same climate event that turned the Sahara into a desert and crowded the Nile Valley also sent a different wave of people cascading into Europe. The modern genetic map of Europe, with its cline of steppe ancestry from east to west, is a fossil of that dry pulse. Language families tell an even clearer story. The Afroasiatic language family, which includes ancient Egyptian, Berber, Somali, and Hausa, has its deepest roots in northeastern Africa. The timing of its expansion correlates with the wet phases of the Green Sahara. During those windows, the Sahara became a corridor rather than a barrier. People carrying the ancestral Afroasiatic language could move freely across the continent, spreading their speech from the highlands of Ethiopia to the Atlas Mountains. When the desert returned, those language communities were isolated in separate refugia, and over millennia, they diverged into the distinct branches we recognize today. The map of Afroasiatic languages is a snapshot of a wet pulse frozen in time. The same logic applies to the Indo-European language family. Its distribution across Europe, Iran, and India matches the vector of the Yamnaya expansion. The oldest branch, Anatolian, is found in what is now Turkey, and its divergent state lines up with the early movement of steppe herders into the region. The Celtic, Italic, Germanic, and Slavic branches all radiate outward from a point on the Pontic steppe. Linguists can even reconstruct words for wheel, wagon, and horse in the Proto-Indo-European language, words that make sense only in a culture that relied on mobility across open grasslands. The language family is a direct inheritance from the climate-driven pastoralist expansion of the Bronze Age. Cultural boundaries also echo ancient climate shifts. The boundary between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christian worlds, for instance, follows a line that was drawn in part by the demographic collapse of the late Antique Little Ice Age. The depopulation of the Balkans during the volcanic winters of the 6th century, allowed Slavic-speaking peoples to settle where Latin and Greek had once dominated. The linguistic border between Romance and Slavic languages in the Balkans reflects not a political treaty but a centuries-long migration driven by cold and hunger. Even the division between settled agricultural societies and nomadic pastoralists, a division that shaped the history of Eurasia, is a product of climate. The steppe belt, where rainfall is too low for reliable farming but high enough for grazing, has shifted over millennia. During wet periods, the boundary moved north, allowing farming to expand. During dry pulses, it pushed south, forcing farmers to abandon their fields and herders to follow the retreating grass. Each shift left behind a residue of abandoned villages, new pasture islands, and populations that blended or displaced one another. The maps we draw today of Europe, Africa, and Asia are not static. They are a palimpsest, an overwritten document where each new climate pulse has erased some lines and drawn others on top. The genetic gradients we see in modern populations are the traces of those ancient journeys. The languages we speak are the echoes of those migrations. The borders we argue over are the scars of those environmental shocks, and the pattern is not finished. The same forces that pushed our ancestors out of Africa and across the steppes are still at work. The next pulse is already forming, and the map will shift again. The question is not whether it will change, but how we will respond when the door opens or closes once more. And yet, a single climate pulse never tells the full story. If it did, every drought would empty a continent, and every warm spell would send people flooding across borders. But history is more stubborn than that. Take the 8.2 thousand-year event, a sudden cold snap that struck around 6,200 years before the present. Ice cores from Greenland show a sharp temperature drop, and the effects rippled across the North Atlantic. In parts of Europe, the cooling was severe enough to force the abandonment of early farming settlements. But in other regions, such as the interior of the Balkans or the forests of northern Scandinavia, the archaeological record shows little change. People stayed where they were. Their hunting and gathering strategies were flexible enough to absorb the shock. The pulse passed and life continued. Why did some communities move while others dug in? The answer lies in a web of factors that climate alone cannot explain. Technology played a powerful role. A society that had developed irrigation canals could survive a drought that would destroy a rain-fed farm. Storage pits, granaries, and techniques for preserving food turned a bad year into an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. The inhabitants of the Indus Valley, for instance, built sophisticated drainage systems and large-scale grain storage. When the monsoon weakened, they did not vanish overnight. They adapted, shifting their crops and moving gradually to more reliable water sources. The collapse that eventually came was not a simple response to drought, but a slow unraveling of a complex system under cumulative pressure. Social organization was equally important. A centralized empire with rigid grain quotas and a distant king might crumble when the rains failed, while a decentralized network of villages, each with its own local knowledge, could spread the risk. The Mycenaean palaces, with their top-down control of resources, proved brittle. The smaller farming communities in the mountains of Crete, by contrast, often weathered the same drought by relying on kinship ties and diverse subsistence strategies. Hierarchy could be a weakness, not a strength. Other forces also pulled people across the map. Trade routes could draw migrants as powerfully as drought could push them. The Silk Road did not emerge from climate stress alone. It grew from a desire for silk, spices, and ideas. War and political instability could set populations in motion even when the harvest was abundant. The rise and fall of empires created corridors of opportunity and walls of danger that had little to do with temperature or rainfall. The best models of ancient migration integrate all these threads. Climate acts as a catalyst, not a dictator. It opens windows and closes doors. It makes certain choices easier or harder, but human decisions shaped by culture, technology, and circumstance determine whether a community steps through that window or builds a wall against the wind. The relationship between humans and their environment is not a one-way street. It is a dance full of unexpected turns and moments of grace. The next great pulse may already be forming, but how we respond will be written not in ice cores but in the choices we make together. Some communities chose to stay and dig in, while others packed and walked away. The difference between those two responses was never simple. It depended on a calculation that played out in the minds of families, elders, and leaders over weeks, seasons, and generations. That calculation is what researchers call the human decision threshold, the point at which the cost of staying outweighs the cost of moving, and climate pulses had a powerful way of pushing societies toward that threshold, not by forcing a single choice, but by slowly draining the options that had once made staying viable. Consider the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. When the monsoon began to weaken around 4,000 years ago, they did not immediately abandon their great cities. Instead, they adapted. Archaeologists have uncovered elaborate cisterns and stepped wells carved into the bedrock, designed to catch and store every drop of seasonal rain. They dug reservoirs that could hold water through the dry months. They shifted their crop choices, planting more drought-tolerant varieties of barley and wheat. For generations, these adaptations worked. The cities remained inhabited, the trade networks held, but the carrying capacity of the land, the maximum number of people that could be sustained by the available resources, was shrinking. Each failed monsoon lowered the threshold a little more. Eventually, the cisterns ran dry, the reservoirs silted up, and the cost of staying climbed too high. The Harappans did not vanish. They moved slowly and in small groups eastward toward the Ganges plain where the rains were still reliable. Their story is not a tale of collapse but of a long, careful retreat that took centuries. On the other side of the world, the ancestral Pueblones of the American Southwest faced a similar pressure but a different outcome for a time. When the droughts of the 12th and 13th centuries hit, they did not scatter. They built cliff dwellings tucked into the sandstone alcoves of the Colorado Plateau. These homes were not just defensive, they were climate shelters. The overhanging rock kept the summer sun off the walls and protected the stored grain from the heat. They built check dams across small washes to catch runoff, and they dug deep storage pits lined with stone and clay to keep their harvest safe from rodents and rot. They also constructed great kivas, ceremonial spaces, that reinforced community bonds during the long dry spells. For a century or more, these adaptations allowed them to stay in a landscape that could no longer support the dispersed villages of earlier times. The fortifications and storage pits that archaeologists find today are not signs of war. They are signs of a people who chose to hunker down, to reorganize their lives around a shrinking zone of abundance. But the threshold eventually arrived. The mega-drought of the late 1200s pushed the carrying capacity below the minimum needed to sustain even the cliff dwellings. The people moved south and east, regrouping into the pueblos that their descendants still occupy today. Now compare those stories with the Bantu Expansion, one of the largest human migrations in history. Beginning around 4,000 years ago, speakers of Bantu languages spread from a homeland in what is now Cameroon and Nigeria across the entire southern half of Africa. What drove them? Climate pulses played a role, but not in the way you might expect. The Bantu did not flee a sudden drought. They moved into a world that was opening up. As the rainforests of Central Africa contracted during a period of drying, the forest gave way to savanna and woodland. These new landscapes were perfect for the crops the Bantu carried: yams, oil palms, and later sorghum and millet. They also brought iron smelting, which allowed them to clear fields and make stronger tools. The carrying capacity of the land was rising for them, not falling. So they moved not from desperation but from opportunity. Each generation pushed a little farther into the empty spaces, following the rivers and the fertile soils. The migration was slow, often peaceful, but it redrew the genetic and linguistic map of Africa from the equator to the Cape of Good Hope. The decision to stay or go was never automatic. It depended on a complex mix of memory, technology, and social bonds. A community that remembered a previous drought and had stored surplus grain might ride out a bad year. A community that had invested generations of labor into terraced fields and irrigation canals would think twice before abandoning them. But when the climate pulse lowered the carrying capacity below a certain threshold, the options narrowed. Archaeologists can see this tipping point in the material record. In the Levant, for instance, the period just before the collapse of the early Bronze Age cities shows a sudden increase in fortifications. Walls were thickened, gates were narrowed, and watchtowers were added. At the same time, storage pits multiplied, dug deeper, and lined with plaster. These are the signs of a society that felt the squeeze, that was investing everything in holding on. But when the drought persisted, the walls could not hold back hunger. The settlements were abandoned and the people moved. In the highlands of New Guinea, where farming began independently thousands of years ago, the response to climate stress took a different form. There, communities built elaborate drainage systems in the swampy valleys, turning wetlands into productive gardens. When the rains grew heavier during certain climate pulses, they dug deeper ditches. When the rains slackened, they filled them in. Their adaptation was not a single invention but a continuous, flexible adjustment. The landscape itself became a record of that flexibility, layers of old channels and raised beds that show a people who never reached the migration threshold because they could always tweak their system. The human decision threshold is not a fixed line. It shifts with every innovation, every storage pit, every new crop variety. Climate pulses lower the carrying capacity, but human ingenuity can raise it again, at least for a while. The question is always the same: how much pressure can a society absorb before the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving? The answer depends on what that society has learned, what it has built, and what it is willing to leave behind. The same thresholds that pushed ancient farmers out of the Fertile Crescent are now being crossed in countries you can find on today's news. In the Sahel, a band of semi-arid land that stretches across Africa south of the Sahara, the rains have become unreliable in a way that looks eerily familiar to anyone who has studied the collapse of the Green Sahara. Over the past 50 years, the length of the rainy season has shrunk by roughly a month in some areas. The grass that once supported herds of cattle and goats is thinner. The wells run dry earlier each year. Families who have herded livestock for generations now face a choice that their great-grandparents never had to make: stay and watch the herd dwindle, or move toward the coast, toward the cities, toward any place where water still falls from the sky with some predictability. This is not a slow, centuries-long pulse. It is a compression of change into a few decades, driven by a warming planet that is shifting the monsoon belt southward and intensifying evaporation. The same principle that governed ancient migrations, a drop in the carrying capacity of the land, is now playing out in real time across the breadth of the continent. Beyond the Sahel, the rising ocean is redrawing coastlines just as Meltwater Pulse one did 14,000 years ago. In Bangladesh, a low-lying delta country crisscrossed by rivers, the sea has already swallowed hundreds of square kilometers of farmland. Saltwater creeps into the rice paddies, poisoning the soil for years. Millions of people live less than a meter above sea level. When a cyclone pushes a storm surge inland, entire villages are washed away. Many of those displaced families do not return. They move to the crowded slums of Dhaka or try to cross borders into India, where they are often met with fences and hostility. The map of Bangladesh is literally shrinking. and the people who live there are following the same logic that drove the inhabitants of Sunderland to higher ground when the ice sheets melted. When the water rises, you either adapt with dikes and floating gardens, or you leave. The most sobering example of a modern climate pulse triggering a cascade of human movement comes from Syria. Between 2006 and 2010, a severe drought gripped the northeastern farming region of the country. It was not just a dry year, it was the worst multi-year drought in the instrumental record, made more than twice as likely by human-caused climate change. The wheat fields turned to dust, the herds of sheep and goats dwindled. As many as 1.5 million farmers and herders abandoned their land and poured into the already crowded cities of Aleppo, Damascus, and Homs. The government, already strained by other pressures, could not absorb them. Unemployment soared, food prices spiked, and social tensions flared. When the protests of 2011 erupted, the drought-displaced population formed a reservoir of desperate people with little to lose. The Syrian civil war, which would eventually displace millions more and reshape the politics of the entire region, did not have a single cause. But the drought that emptied the countryside was a crucial ingredient, a climate pulse that pushed a fragile society past its breaking point. The parallels to the 4.2 Kiloyear event or the late Bronze Age collapse are uncomfortable. In each of those ancient cases, a prolonged drought weakened the agricultural base of a complex society, and the resulting social stress led to conflict, migration, and the redrawing of political borders. The difference today is scale and speed. The ancient pulses unfolded over decades or centuries, giving societies time to adapt, to move in slow waves, to merge with neighboring groups. The modern pulse is global. The warming we are causing is raising temperatures across every continent simultaneously. The sea is rising everywhere at once. The monsoon belts are shifting in patterns that affect the food supply of billions, and the rate of change is faster than anything recorded in the ice cores. A farmer in the Sahel today does not have a century to decide whether to move. She has a single generation. The principles remain the same. Every society has a threshold, and when the carrying capacity of the land drops below what is needed to sustain the population, people will move. The difference is that today, the carrying capacity is dropping faster than it has in any of the ancient pulses we have traced. The innovations that once raised the threshold, irrigation, storage, crop diversification, are still available, but they require investment, infrastructure, and political will. Not every community has access to those tools. The maps we use today are not permanent. They were drawn in a climate that no longer exists. The borders we take for granted were established during a period of unusual stability, the few centuries of the Holocene when the planet was neither too hot nor too cold, when the rains fell where they were expected. That stability is ending. The next climate pulse is already underway, and it is not a natural cycle. It is a pulse of our own making, but its consequences will follow the same logic that pushed our ancestors out of Africa and across the steppes. The questions that historians ask about the past are now questions we must ask about our own time. Where will the next wave of migration go? Which societies will adapt and which will fracture? What will the world map look like in 50 years when the coastlines have shifted and the breadbaskets have moved? The past does not give us a blueprint, but it does give us a mirror. Every ancient migration we have examined was a response to a threshold being crossed. We are crossing that threshold again. The only difference is that we can see it coming. For all that scientists have uncovered, the timeline still holds deep shadows. The connection between a climate pulse and a human migration is rarely as precise as we would like. A drought is recorded in a stalagmite with an error margin of a few decades, but the archaeological evidence for a population movement might be dated only within a few centuries. That gap leaves room for ambiguity. Did the people leave during the worst year of the drought or a generation later? Did the pulse trigger the migration, or was it just one factor among many? These questions are not academic trivia. They are the difference between understanding a cause and merely seeing a correlation. Another major gap is regional variability. The same climate pulse that turned the Sahara into a desert might have brought extra rain to the Ethiopian highlands. A cold snap in the North Atlantic could have weakened the monsoon in India while leaving the Yangtze Valley untouched. Global climate reconstructions show averages, but human beings do not live in averages. They live in specific valleys, slopes, and coastlines. Researchers are only beginning to create regional climate records fine enough to match the local decisions of ancient communities. The role of disease as a cofactor is even harder to pin down. When a population is weakened by malnutrition from a failed harvest, they become more vulnerable to illness. A wave of sickness can then accelerate the decision to move or can decimate a group so thoroughly that their migration leaves no trace. But ancient pathogens rarely preserve in the archaeological record. Scientists can detect some infectious diseases in skeletal remains, but the evidence is spotty. The link between climate stress and health challenges remains one of the most elusive pieces of the puzzle. Tracking non-sedentary populations presents its own difficulty. Nomadic herders and hunter-gatherers leave behind fewer permanent structures, fewer trash pits, fewer burials. Their movements are often invisible in the traditional archaeological record. When a climate pulse pushed pastoralists across the steppe, they did not build cities that could be excavated centuries later. They left behind only a scatter of stone tools, the bones of their animals, and perhaps a few pottery sherds. Reconstructing their migrations requires a different kind of detective work, one that relies heavily on genetic fingerprints and linguistic patterns. But those methods have their own limitations. Ancient DNA can reveal that a population moved, but it often cannot tell us exactly when or why. New techniques are beginning to fill these gaps. High-resolution ice core chronology now allows scientists to date volcanic eruptions and climate shifts to within a year or two in some cases. When those precise dates are matched to tree ring records from across the northern hemisphere, the timing of a climate event can be pinned down with remarkable accuracy. Ancient DNA, extracted from the bones of individuals who lived during the migrations themselves, is giving researchers a direct window into the movement of genes across generations. By comparing the genomes of ancient and modern people, scientists can map the branches of the human family tree with ever greater detail. Climate modeling has also become a powerful tool. Researchers can simulate the conditions of a specific decade or century, then see how those conditions would have affected crop yields, pasture growth, and water availability. When the model predicts a region would have become uninhabitable at the same time that archaeological sites were abandoned, the case for a climate-driven migration grows stronger. These models are not perfect, but they are improving every year. The picture that is emerging is more nuanced than the simple story of drought pushing people out. It is a story of thresholds crossed at different times in different places, of communities that adapted and those that could not, of decisions made with incomplete information in the face of a changing world. The gaps in our knowledge are not failures, they are invitations. Every new sediment core, every ancient genome, every refined climate model adds another piece to the puzzle. The map of the past is still being drawn, and the most exciting discoveries may still lie ahead. Yet the picture we have already drawn is vivid enough to reshape how we see the world around us. Every border you cross, every language you hear, every genetic trait you carry holds a trace of some ancient climate pulse. The line between Romance languages in southern Europe and Germanic languages in the north does not follow a river or a mountain range by accident. It follows the boundary where the Roman Empire's grain fields once thrived, a boundary carved by the same Mediterranean rainfall patterns that shifted during the Little Ice Age. When the cold settled in, the lands north of the Alps became less reliable for the crops that had supported Roman civilization. The frontier hardened, and the linguistic divide was frozen into place. The map of Europe, with its patchwork of language families, is not a testament to conquest alone. It is a fossil of past climates, a record written in the very sounds people used to speak. Step back and look at any continent. In Africa, the boundary between Niger-Congo and Nilo-Saharan languages traces the edge of the retreating Green Sahara. In Asia, the spread of Sino-Tibetan languages follows the river valleys that remained fertile when the monsoon weakened. In the Americas, the distribution of Native American language families aligns closely with the zones where the climate was stable enough to support dense populations during the Holocene. The world map is not a static document handed down by diplomats. It is a living archive of decisions made under pressure from wind, rain, and ice. Every line on that map was drawn, at least in part, by the rhythm of the planet. What does this mean for us today? The same forces that pushed our ancestors out of Africa and across the steppes are still active, but now we have a choice. We can see the patterns, measure the thresholds, and anticipate the windows that are opening or closing. Understanding that the map has always been dynamic, that it never stopped shifting, might help us face the changes ahead with a little more wisdom. The past does not tell us what will happen, but it does remind us that human beings have always adapted, moved, and reinvented themselves when the climate demanded it. The next pulse is already here. The question is whether we will read the map in time. Climate pulses have been the hidden cartographers of our past. From the first modern humans stepping out of Africa through a green Sahara to the Yamnaya herders pouring across the steppes, from the farmers of the Fertile Crescent who invented agriculture under the pressure of the Younger Dryas to the empires that crumbled during the 4.2 Kiloyear event, the same rhythm repeats. A sudden shift in rainfall or temperature lowered the land's ability to support the people who lived there. Some communities adapted, inventing new tools and new ways of organizing themselves. Others moved, carrying their languages and their genes into new territories. And some, like the Norse Greenlanders or the cities of the Indus Valley, simply vanished, their places taken by new groups who had learned to read the changing world. The thread that runs through all these stories is not conquest or ambition alone. It is vulnerability. Human civilization has always depended on a narrow band of climatic stability, a band that has shifted again and again. The maps we draw today, the borders we defend, the languages we speak, all of them are built on the ruins of older maps that were erased by a change in the wind or a failure of the rains. The next pulse is already forming. The question is not whether the map will change, but whether we have learned enough from the past to navigate that change wisely. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. If we listen to the echoes of those ancient migrations, we might recognize the thresholds we are approaching today. I would love to hear which of these migrations surprised you the most. Was it the Green Sahara opening like a corridor, or the drought that broke the Bronze Age, or the volcanic winter that redrew the Balkans? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the hidden forces that shaped our world, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more maps to read and more pulses to follow.